Have you ever wondered how it all began? The story of Genesis goes far beyond ancient accounts. It reveals God's purpose for humanity. From the creation of the world, the fall of man, to the stories of Noah, Abraham, and Joseph, each chapter is filled with valuable lessons that shape our spiritual lives. Here you will discover Genesis in an unprecedented way, exploring the deep meaning behind events like the creation of Adam and Eve and God's covenant with the patriarchs. Ready to dive into this journey? The narrative of the creation of the world, according to Genesis, is one of the most impressive accounts in the Bible. In 6 days, God organizes chaos and brings everything we know into existence: the sky, the earth, light, and the waters. Each detail is described with grandeur and purpose, and in the end, man and woman are created in the image and likeness of God, as seen in Genesis 1:27. The complete story of Genesis shows us not only the physical creation of the universe, but also the emergence of a unique relationship between the Creator and humanity, something that becomes evident in the creation of Adam and Eve. They were placed in Eden not only to live, but also to care for the world created by God. The Garden of Eden in Genesis is described as a perfect place where Adam and Eve had everything they needed, and their relationship with God was direct and without barriers. This paradise symbolized harmony between heaven and earth. However, the most remarkable thing is the role God entrusted to humanity, to take care of creation and have dominion over the earth, as seen in the Genesis 1:28. This command highlights the great responsibility of mankind toward the world around them, illustrating that God, in creating everything perfectly, also delegated care to humans, a task that echoes to this day. In this beginning, Genesis and the origin of humanity go hand in hand, as everything started with this special relationship between God, man, and woman. The creation of the world, according to Genesis, presents us with a deeply spiritual, yet practical narrative that points to the purpose of life: to live in communion with God, and to be stewards of what He created. However, this balance would soon be challenged, as we will see next with the fall of man in Genesis, which would forever alter this harmony. The fall of man in Genesis is one of the most dramatic and significant moments in the complete story of Genesis. It all begins with the serpent, which cunningly leads Eve to question God's command. By eating the forbidden fruit, she and Adam violate the one commandment that God had given them. Genesis 3 narrates this disobedience, which introduces sin and death into the world. From that moment on, the relationship between God and humanity, which was perfect in the Garden of Eden, is broken, and the peace that reigned there is replaced by shame, fear, and separation. This narrative is filled with deep symbolism. The act of Adam and Eve eating the fruit was not just a physical action, but represented the human desire to be self-sufficient, to want to determine their own destiny, disregarding divine guidance. The creation of Adam and Eve, which until then reflected God's purity and care, now bore the consequences of sin. As a result, God expels the man and woman from Eden, imposing on them the burden of hard labor and mortality, as we read in Genesis 3:19. The perfect world of creation became corrupt, and suffering became part of the human experience. However, even in the face of the fall, we see God's covenant in Genesis beginning to unfold. Despite their disobedience, God continues to love and care for His creation, promising that one day there would be redemption. The fall is not the end of the story, but the beginning of a long journey of restoration that runs throughout the Bible. And thus, the spiritual lessons of Genesis start to reveal themselves, showing that even in moments of greatest human failure, there is a promise of hope. This hope, however, would be overshadowed by further tragedies, such as the first tragedy among Adam and Eve's children, Cain and Abel. The complete story of Genesis brings us an emotional account of Cain and Abel, the two sons of Adam and Eve. This narrative presents the first human conflict, which resulted in the first tragedy in human history. Cain, the firstborn, offers a sacrifice to God, just like his brother Abel. However, God is pleased with Abel's offering and not with Cain's, which stirs deep jealousy in Cain. Overcome by resentment, Cain kills Abel, marking the first murder, as described in Genesis 4:8. This sad event shows how the sin introduced by the fall of man in Genesis had already begun to corrupt creation. The consequence of this act is severe. God confronts Cain, asking him, "Where is your brother Abel?" Cain's response, "Am I my brother's keeper?" Genesis 4:9 reflects the hardness of his heart. As punishment, Cain is cursed and condemned to be a wanderer on the earth, without peace or rest. Cain's curse illustrates that sin brings both spiritual and physical consequences, affecting not only the relationship with God, but also life in the created world. From this point on, the fall of man in Genesis becomes even more evident, revealing the complexities and tragedies that sin causes in human life. Yet even in this episode, God's covenant in Genesis remains present. Although Cain is punished, God still protects him by placing a mark on him to prevent anyone from killing him. Genesis 4:15. This act of divine mercy shows that even in the midst of tragedy and human error, God still offers grace. The complete story of Genesis continues to show the development of humanity, now also marked by Seth, another son of Adam and Eve, whose lineage would continue the godly line. Nevertheless, wickedness would continue to grow, leading to the critical moment of the flood in Genesis, which we will explore next. With wickedness spreading across the earth, God decides to restart creation. The biblical account of Genesis introduces us to Noah, a righteous man amidst a corrupt generation. God instructs Noah to build an ark, a task that would require great faith and obedience. The complete story of Genesis describes the flood as an act of judgment on human wickedness, but also as an opportunity for redemption, as Noah, his family, and a pair of each species of animal would be saved. This event becomes a landmark in the relationship between God and humanity, showing both divine justice and mercy. For 40 days and 40 nights, the waters covered the entire earth, destroying everything. However, God remembered Noah and his covenant, causing the waters to recede, as described in Genesis 8:1. After the flood, Noah and his family leave the ark to find a new world. God makes a covenant with Noah, promising never again to destroy the earth with a flood, and setting the rainbow as the sign of this promise. Genesis 9:13. God's covenant in Genesis reaffirms his desire to preserve and guide humanity, even in the face of their weaknesses. This episode offers a great lesson about the consequences of disobedience, but also a reminder of God's patience and love. The story of Noah teaches us that, like the creation of the world according to Genesis, the recreation after the flood happens with purpose. God desired that the survivors would be responsible for a new humanity. But despite this new beginning, humanity would still face challenges, such as the construction of the Tower of Babel in Genesis, which would soon reveal the continued human tendency toward pride and self-sufficiency. The complete story of Genesis continues with the account of the Tower of Babel, an episode that highlights human pride and the desire for self-sufficiency. After the flood, humanity grows and spreads across the earth, but instead of seeking God's will, people decide to build a tower that would reach the heavens. Their goal was to make a name for themselves, showing an attitude of rebellion and independence. In Genesis 11:4, the desire to build the tower symbolizes humanity's attempt to live without dependence on God, a repetition of the error that began with the fall of man in Genesis. God observes this construction, and realizing the danger of human unity based on pride and self-sufficiency, he decides to confuse the languages of the builders. As a result, those who once spoke the same language can no longer understand each other, and the construction of the tower is halted. The people are scattered over the face of the earth, and the place becomes known as Babel, meaning confusion. Genesis 11:9. The origin of nations in Genesis is explained through this event, showing how God intervenes directly in human affairs to prevent self-destruction and arrogance from disrupting the created order. This episode offers profound lessons about the limits of human power. Just as in the creation of the world according to Genesis, God demonstrates that no matter how much humanity tries, it can never take the place of the Creator. The Tower of Babel in Genesis is a reminder of the need for humility and the importance of seeking God's will in all things. However, after this dispersion, God reveals a new plan through a man named Abraham, to whom he would make extraordinary promises. And so, the complete story of Genesis introduces us to the life of Abraham, which we will explore in the next section. The complete story of Genesis introduces us to Abraham, one of the most important figures in Scripture. He is called by God to leave his homeland and embark on a journey of faith toward a land that would be shown to him. In Genesis 12:1-3, God makes an extraordinary promise to Abraham. He would make him the father of a great nation and bless all the families of the earth through him. From this moment, God's covenant in Genesis begins to take clearer shape, showing that the divine plan for redeeming humanity was unfolding through Abraham's descendants. Throughout his life, Abraham faces challenges that test his faith. He and his wife Sarah, advanced in age, struggle with not having children, which puts the fulfillment of God's promise in doubt. However, as a proof of his faithfulness, God gives them a son, Isaac, in their old age, fulfilling the divine promise. Abraham also experiences moments of great tension, such as when God asks him to sacrifice his son, Genesis 22. However, at the last moment, God provides a ram as a substitute, reaffirming that his promises would be fulfilled without failure. Abraham's life is marked by trust in God, even when circumstances seemed impossible. He teaches us profound lessons about obedience and faith, demonstrating that God is faithful to keep his promises, even when their fulfillment appears distant. The complete story of Genesis reveals that Abraham not only became the father of the nation of Israel, but his faith serves as an example for all generations. The next chapter of this journey continues with the challenges faced by his son, Isaac, and the family conflicts that would shape the destiny of the nation of Israel. The complete story of Genesis now takes us to the life of Isaac, the son of Abraham. Like his father, Isaac faces challenges that test his faith and obedience to God. Married to Rebekah, he is the father of twin sons, Esau and Jacob. From birth, it is clear that the relationship between the brothers will be troubled. Genesis 25:23 reveals that even before they were born, God had determined that the older will serve the younger, setting the stage for future conflicts. The favoritism Isaac shows toward Esau and Rebekah's preference for Jacob only intensifies the tension. With his mother's help, Jacob deceives his father, Isaac, and receives the blessing intended for Esau. Genesis 27. This act of deception causes a deep rift in the family, forcing Jacob to flee to avoid his brother's wrath. This conflict marks the story of Isaac and Jacob and reflects the struggle for divine favor and the blessings that had been promised. However, God, who had promised Abraham that his lineage would be blessed, continues to guide Jacob's steps. Throughout his journey, Jacob faces the consequences of his actions, but also experiences powerful encounters with God, such as when he wrestles with an angel and is given the name Israel. Genesis 32:28. The life of Jacob and Esau teaches us about redemption and God's mercy, even amid deception and family conflict. In the end, Jacob and Esau reconcile, showing that despite human failings, God is able to restore relationships. The complete story of Genesis continues with Jacob's descendants, who would become the 12 tribes of Israel. The next chapter will take us to the incredible story of Joseph, Jacob's favored son, whose journey to Egypt would mark a new beginning for the people of Israel. The complete story of Genesis introduces us to Joseph, the favored son of Jacob, known for his integrity and his faith in God. From a young age, Joseph was blessed with prophetic dreams that indicated he would have a great future. However, his favored position caused jealousy among his brothers, who, driven by anger, sold him as a slave to Egypt. Genesis 37:28. Despite the betrayal and the adversities he faced, Joseph's journey reveals how God was present in every stage of his life, turning what was meant for evil into good. In Egypt, Joseph endures many trials, including being falsely accused and imprisoned. Yet even in prison, he maintains his unshakable faith and continues to use his gift of interpreting dreams. This leads him to Pharaoh, who, impressed by Joseph's divine wisdom, appoints him as governor of Egypt, the second most powerful man in the empire. Genesis 41:39-40. God's covenant in Genesis manifests once again, as Joseph is now in a position of power, capable of saving his family and many nations from famine, demonstrating how God works through seemingly impossible circumstances. Joseph's journey in Egypt teaches us that even in the face of the greatest difficulties, God always has a greater purpose. When his brothers come to Egypt seeking food, Joseph tests them, but ultimately reveals his true identity. In an emotional moment, he tells them, "You intended to harm me, but God intended it for good." Genesis 50:20. Joseph's forgiveness exemplifies the spiritual lessons of Genesis about redemption and God's sovereign plan. The story of Joseph closes the book of Genesis with a powerful message about faith, family, and God's power to restore even the most complicated situations. The biblical examples in Genesis clearly show how God interacts with humanity, revealing deep spiritual principles. From the creation of the world according to Genesis, we see how God acts with purpose and order in giving life to all things. The story of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden exemplifies the human responsibility to follow God's commandments, while the fall of man in Genesis teaches about the consequences of sin and the loss of direct relationship with the Creator. These examples form the foundation for all Christian theology, showing from the very beginning the need for redemption. Another important example is the story of Cain and Abel. It offers a powerful lesson about the human heart and the destructive power of envy and jealousy. Cain's murder of his brother Abel demonstrates how sin entered humanity in a personal and tragic way. These biblical accounts in Genesis also show that even in the midst of sin, God still engages with mercy, as when he protects Cain from being killed in revenge. Each of these stories reflects not only human errors, but also God's grace, which always seeks restoration. Additionally, we have the narrative of Noah and the flood in Genesis, where God's justice is demonstrated in punishing the growing wickedness, but also his mercy in saving Noah and his family. The biblical account of Genesis is filled with examples that shape our understanding of justice, redemption, and God's plan for humanity. And these examples continue to the end of the book, as seen in the story of Joseph, where we witness God's ability to turn the worst suffering into something that fulfills his purpose. These biblical examples serve as markers that guide our spiritual journey. The theological interpretation of the book of Genesis helps us understand not only the historical accounts, but also the divine purposes behind each event. The creation of the world, according to Genesis, reveals God's sovereignty as the creator of everything that exists. Each day of creation demonstrates divine order, and at the end, God declares that everything was very good. Genesis 1:31, highlighting the perfection of God's original plan for humanity and the universe. The creation of Adam and Eve shows God's intention to create beings with whom he could have an intimate relationship, distinct from all other creatures. The fall of man in Genesis is theologically understood as the moment when sin entered the world, breaking the perfect communion between God and humanity. This event affected not only Adam and Eve, but all of humanity that would come after them. Christian theology teaches that since then, sin and death have dominated the world, necessitating the need for a Redeemer, as prophesied in Genesis 3:15, where God promises that the offspring of the woman would crush the serpent's head, a reference to Christ's ultimate victory over sin. Another key aspect of the theological interpretation of Genesis is the covenant God makes with Noah after the flood, and later with Abraham. God's covenant in Genesis sets a pattern of relationship where God chooses a people for himself, blesses this nation, and through it, brings salvation to the world. Abraham's call to be the father of a great nation is not only a physical promise, but also a spiritual one. Through these covenants, God reveals that he has a redemptive plan that culminates in Christ. These covenants are foundational for understanding the theology of Genesis and the Bible as a whole. The teachings from the book of Genesis have a profound impact on personal life, addressing fundamental questions about human existence, faith, and our relationship with God. The creation of the world, according to Genesis, reminds us that God made us with a purpose. Every person is part of a larger plan and was created in the image and likeness of God, which gives us inherent value and dignity. Understanding this can change how we view ourselves and others, promoting a sense of responsibility to care for creation and respect humanity. The fall of man in Genesis also speaks directly to the human condition. It explains why suffering, death, and struggles exist in the world. This knowledge can help individuals better understand the challenges they face in life, knowing that sin is present, but also that God offers redemption. This brings comfort and hope amidst difficulties. The mistake of Adam and Eve shows us that even when we fail, God does not abandon his plan. Grace and forgiveness are always available, which can completely transform the way we deal with our own errors and failures. Moreover, the story of Joseph in Egypt teaches us about resilience and trust in God, even in difficult times. Joseph was betrayed by his brothers and sold into slavery, but his faith in God kept him strong. He knew how to wait and trust in God's timing, and his patience was grandly rewarded. For those experiencing injustice, betrayal, or suffering, Joseph's example serves as a reminder that God can transform the most adverse situations into blessings, and that God's purpose always prevails, even when we cannot immediately see it. The spiritual practices revealed in the book of Genesis are fundamental to a life of faith and can be directly applied to anyone's daily life. The creation of the world, according to Genesis, teaches us the importance of rest and contemplation, as after 6 days of creation, God rested on the seventh day, Genesis 2:2-3. This concept gave rise to the Sabbath, a practice of pausing and recognizing God's work, allowing moments of reflection and spiritual renewal. In the same way, setting aside time for meditation and rest can help renew the soul and keep the focus on the relationship with the Creator. Another example of spiritual practices is the active faith demonstrated by Abraham. When God called him to leave his land and go to an unknown place, Abraham obeyed, fully trusting in God's promises. This practice of trusting God, even without knowing the immediate results, is something that can be lived out daily. Trusting God in times of uncertainty, praying for wisdom and discernment, and acting based on that faith are practical steps anyone can take. Abraham's life of prayer, combined with his obedience, serves as a model of a living and effective spiritual practice. Furthermore, the story of Joseph and his journey in Egypt teaches us about the practice of patience and perseverance in faith. Even though Joseph was unjustly treated, he maintained his integrity and trust in God, praying and waiting for the right time. He not only survived adversity, but also prospered spiritually, becoming an example of how faith can be practiced in times of hardship. His prayers and trust in God kept him steadfast until the moment God exalted him. Practicing patience, especially in times of trial, is a way of following the spiritual examples offered in Genesis. The book of Genesis addresses many common challenges and doubts that resonate in people's lives even today. One of the first great challenges faced by humanity was the desire to control their own destiny, symbolized by the fall of man in Genesis. Adam and Eve had to grapple with the doubt, does God really want what's best for us? This questioning led to disobedience and, consequently, separation from God. Many people still wonder today why there are so many rules and difficulties in life. The lesson of Genesis is that the true challenge lies in trusting God's wisdom and goodness, even when things don't seem to make sense. Another common challenge is present in the story of Joseph in Egypt when he was betrayed by his own brothers. Many times, we feel wronged, betrayed by those close to us, or disillusioned with life's circumstances. Joseph could have lost hope, but he trusted that God was in control, even during the darkest moments. His story raises the question, why do bad things happen to good people? Genesis teaches us that while we may not understand the immediate purpose, God works through difficulties to bring about a greater good. As Joseph expresses when forgiving his brothers, saying, "What you intended for harm, God intended for good." Genesis 50:20. The doubt about the future is also a recurring theme in Genesis. Abraham, for example, had to trust God's promise that he would be the father of a great nation, even when his wife Sarah was barren and they were both elderly. This challenge of waiting for the fulfillment of God's promises is something many people face today. How do we keep faith when the results seem impossible or delayed? Genesis shows that God is faithful, but he works in his time, not ours. These challenges of faith, doubt, and patience are common to everyone, and the book of Genesis offers answers and examples to overcome them. Community action in the book of Genesis is implicit in various stories that show us the importance of caring for others and cooperation among people. The story of Noah and the flood in Genesis is a striking example of how God used a family to preserve humanity and the animals. Noah and his sons worked together to build the ark, a community effort that saved God's creation. This narrative teaches us about the importance of family and community cooperation in times of crisis, showing that, with joint effort, it is possible to face great challenges and save lives. Another clear example of community action is Joseph's journey in Egypt. After being sold into slavery and later becoming governor of Egypt, Joseph used his position to save not only Egypt, but also several other nations from famine. He coordinated a food storage plan during the years of plenty to sustain the people during the years of scarcity. Genesis 41:48 to 49. This example highlights the importance of leaders who think about the common good and act wisely to protect their communities in times of adversity. Joseph's ability to forgive his brothers and reunite his family after the harm they caused him also shows the power of reconciliation within the community. Moreover, God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis has community implications that extend beyond his immediate family. God promised that through Abraham's descendants, all the families of the earth shall be blessed. Genesis 12:3. This calling implies a community responsibility that goes beyond family ties and encompasses all of humanity. From this promise, we see the beginning of what would become the great nation of Israel, whose purpose was to serve as an example to other nations. God's commitment to a united and blessed community is reflected in all the interactions in Genesis, teaching us that the common good should always be a priority. The practice of prayer and meditation is a constant theme implicit in the narratives of Genesis, revealing the intimacy that the biblical characters maintained with God. From the very beginning, with the creation of the world according to Genesis, we see that God seeks communication with humans, as shown in his direct interactions with Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden, Genesis 3:8 through 9. This relationship of closeness and dialogue with the Creator serves as the foundation for the practice of prayer, a moment of reflection and connection with the divine that is repeated throughout the Bible. The life of Abraham is another great example of prayer and meditation. On several occasions, we see Abraham conversing with God, interceding for the salvation of cities like Sodom and Gomorrah, Genesis 18:23 to 33, and seeking guidance about his journey and future. This constant communication reflects the trust he placed in God, and his posture of intercession demonstrates how prayer can impact not only his personal life, but also the lives of others. Through these moments of prayer, Abraham not only sought answers, but also meditated on God's faithfulness and the promises he had made to him. Another example of prayer and meditation in Genesis can be seen in the story of Jacob, especially when he wrestles with the angel. This encounter, described in Genesis 32:24-30, is one of the most significant moments of introspection and personal transformation. Jacob spent the night praying and meditating, seeking God's blessing, and this resulted in a change of identity. He was renamed Israel. This event teaches us that through prayer and meditation, we not only find answers, but also undergo profound spiritual transformations. Thus, Genesis shows us that constant dialogue with God is essential for the growth and maturation of faith. The book of Genesis is filled with messages about the future and hope, unfolding through God's promises and the stories of its main characters. God's covenant with Abraham in Genesis, for example, brings the promise of a bright future not only for him, but for all of humanity. In Genesis 12:2-3, God promises to make Abraham a great nation, and that all the families of the earth will be blessed through his descendants. This promise points to a hopeful future, not only for Abraham's descendants, but for all who would come to be part of this covenant through faith. The story of Joseph in Egypt is another great example of how God can transform situations of despair into hope. Despite the adversities, Joseph never lost sight of the future that God had revealed to him in dreams. Even after being betrayed and sold into slavery, Joseph trusted in God, and in the end, he was not only elevated to the position of governor of Egypt, but also saved his family from famine, Genesis 50:20. Joseph's life shows us that even in moments of suffering and uncertainty, God is always working towards a greater purpose, and the hope of a better future remains present. Moreover, the book of Genesis emphasizes that humanity has always been at the center of God's divine plan for the future. From the creation of the world, according to Genesis, God showed that he not only created humanity, but also has a plan for its redemption and restoration. The future, promised to Abraham and partially fulfilled through his descendants, culminates in the expectation of the coming of a Redeemer who would bring the fullness of hope to all. Genesis, therefore, lays the foundation of a hope that goes beyond immediate circumstances, pointing to a future full of purpose and communion with God. The journey through Genesis has shown us much more than just a simple narrative. It revealed God's purpose for humanity, the consequences of sin, and the transformative power of faith. But the big question is, how will you apply all of this to your life? How can the creation of the world, according to Genesis, or Joseph's journey in Egypt, shape your daily decisions and your relationship with God? The complete story of Genesis offers you the opportunity to deeply reflect on your choices and your faith. If Genesis teaches us anything, it's that the future is always in God's hands, and there is hope in his promises, even amidst the greatest difficulties. So why not start applying these principles in your life today? Reflect on the examples of Abraham, Jacob, and Joseph, and see how trusting in God can transform your reality. Don't let this wisdom be mere knowledge. Turn it into practice. Now that you've explored Genesis in a new way, what caught your attention the most? Comment below, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel to keep exploring biblical truths with us.